Mike Moore once talked about lamb burgers. Listeners who were in New Zealand at the time will almost certainly remember it. 3 decades on, many of our biggest exporting industries still do much of their processing overseas. Forestry offers a striking example. We export an increasing percentage of our wood as raw logs, increasing, not decreasing, which means we're missing out on jobs here in New Zealand, and the value jobs add to the economy. And now we can add merino to them. It's turned into yarn fabric and clothing primarily in Asia, which of course raises concern around ethical treatment of workers and, again, the jobs that we're not doing here. How do we ensure that wool we're exporting isn't ending up in sweatshops? Who's keeping an eye on this? Zac Fleming wanted to find out, so he travelled to Vietnam earlier this year, courtesy of the Asia New Zealand Foundation, for a series of stories. One of these was a visit to a New Zealand-based merino company that's recently moved its manufacturing there. But first, his story starts at the beginning, in the South Island.
Hey, Phil. Willie, Phil. Oh, Willie, Poppy, come here.
Double Hill, Canterbury, almost literally the middle of the South Island. No cell phone reception, a visit to the supermarkets, a 2.5-hour round trip, and more than 500 metres above sea level it can drop to -15 in winter. Hard for humans, but perfect for merino sheep.
So this wool here is sort of 15.5 microns. Human hair is about 60 microns, so it's very minute, I suppose.
So this is a quarter of the width of a human hair?
Basically, yeah.
15 microns is close to as good as it gets. Paul Ensaw's merino is classed as super fine.
There's been a lot of people move away from merino just because it's easier animals to farm, really, you know. I always think of a merino farmer, they're just kind of like a craft brewer, you know. You've got to really focus on what you're doing and get everything right through the year. So if you use having a lamb, that might put pressure on her and result in lesser quality fibre being produced. So I think just the focus you've got to have and the attention to details a lot higher.
When you get it right, you get merino that's so fine it can be woven with silk, but still strong enough that it doesn't break when you pull at it. New Zealand merino is widely regarded as the best in the world. We're the 3rd biggest producer of it. Paul took over the family farm from his parents. Their property is at the end of Ensaw's Road and now produces around 25,000 kilos of merino a year, 50% more than it did just a few years ago.
We've invested heavily in the farm, and in the last 3 to 5 years we've probably invested over $500,000 to do that.
He's banking on the price of high quality merino staying strong. He sells his for around $28 a kilo at the moment. But almost none of it is processed here. Paul's sheep are due to be shorn at the end of July. It'll take just 10 days to shear all 6,000. And then this merino will be shipped primarily overseas. Paul's is very high quality fibre, so most of it will end up in Italy. Almost all of our merino is exported raw. So where does it go? And is it handled ethically? One of our biggest overseas processors is Designer Textiles, which was founded in Otara in Auckland in 1965. It used to process in New Zealand, but was bought out by South Korea's outdoor apparel giant Youngwon Corporation, and then finalised its move to Vietnam in 2016.
When we had manufacturing in New Zealand, it was meaning that the product was then having to come back to New Zealand, which would then go back to the supply chain, you know, in terms of garment manufacture, which is in Asia. So, you know, it wasn't just cost, you know, it was travelling all around the world.
CEO Brett McIlride says Designer Textiles, or DTI for short, used to send merino to Asia to be spun into yarn. Then the yarn would come back to New Zealand, where DTI would make it into fabric, and then the fabric would be sent back to Asia to garment manufacturers.
Somewhat illogical. So now we've cut out a component of that in terms of, you know, the return to New Zealand. And it was obviously sad to see, you know, this facility shut after such a long history in New Zealand. But the reality is, you know, just to be efficient and cost, lead time, etc., it was logical that it moved that way.
So now all of its fabric is made here, in Nam Dinh, an hour and a half south of Vietnam's capital, Hanoi, in a huge textile and garment industrial park that employs nearly 9,000 people. 162 of those are with DTI, which occupies 3 sheds, each around the size of a large supermarket. All workers are given free lunch and health checks and paid a living wage. Conditions are first world. Simplified, what DTI does is
getting a yarn, knitting it, applying colour to it, and then selling it as a finished fabric to the garment contractor.
the finished product's 60-metre rolls of fabric, like these ones. It could be 100% merino or it could be a merino blend, but it averages around $15 per metre. And with more than 14,000 rolls of fabric in this warehouse, that means there's more than $17.5 million worth of fabric just here. DTI's business has flourished since moving to Vietnam. It's now booked out up to 9 months in advance.
The raw material to us, when it comes into our facility, is in yarn form, so it's as someone would have a ball of wool. It's not quite like that, but in a yarn form, and then we knit it. So we have machines in place, high-speed knitting machines that we knit the fabric.
More than 70 knitting machines make one roll of fabric every half hour, and all of it's inspected by humans, people whose job it is to sit and watch fabric roll by. At this point, to anyone not in the industry, it all looks the same, rolls of white fabric inside black plastic bags, because undyed merino goes yellow if it's exposed to light. Dyeing is the most difficult part. Colours are tested and then retested until perfect in heat and humidity controlled labs. Because once a colour's locked in, sometimes tons of fabric is dyed at once. The dyeing process takes anywhere from 6 to 19 hours, depending on whether it's 100% merino or a blend. After that, it has to be washed, softened, dried, and then cut, set and stretched into the right dimensions. And then at the very end, depending on the client, complex patterns can be digitally printed, thanks to new technology. The fabric is then driven just 200 metres across the compound to factories like this one, where it's made into garments for some of the world's biggest outdoor sportswear companies. And that's why its business has flourished since moving to Vietnam. Where it used to bounce its merino all around the world, now it just moves it across the compound, which also makes it incredibly easy to ensure working conditions are up to standard. We can't tell you what clothes are being made in this factory, but Checkpoint is the first media organisation to be allowed to film in it. Staff weren't given a heads up we were coming. Security tried to stop us at first, but the head of the industrial park allowed us entry. There are hundreds of seamstresses in this warehouse, but there's room for hundreds of seamstresses. Conditions looked good, and we were told wages are around 1.5 times the minimum wage of around 250 New Zealand dollars a month. Much of this is a result of companies like ZQ Merino, which enforces standards for farmers here in New Zealand and then ensures standards stay ethical further down the line too. Both DTI and Paul Ensor use ZQ.
When we're supplying through that, we're pretty assured that the people further down the chain are going to care just as much and provide a good product for the consumer.
So while it's not processed here in New Zealand anymore, there is still an element of control. Paul is gearing up to share in the next few weeks, and then he's off to a conference in Australia to upskill, not content with wool 1/4 the width of a human hair. And in his backyard that looks like a tourism advertisement, he tells me he's confident merino will continue to grow.
Everyone's looking for natural products, aren't they?
For Checkpoint, Zac Fleming.
And Zac travelled to Vietnam courtesy of the Asia New Zealand Foundation. You can watch that story and his 2 others about 2 young New Zealand women helping save Vietnam's under threat moon bears and a World Vision Aid project on our website.